Welcome back, everybody, to Hearthstone Masters Tour Seoul. My name is Gia, and joining me for round 5 is Brian Kibler. And looks like we've got a very spicy matchup coming up for this one.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of kind of a decent variety of decks so far, but I think that we may be seeing a matchup between two players playing one of the decks we've seen about the least, which is Priest.
Yes, Priest has been kind of rumbling, to use a Derek term, under the surface as one of those decks that seemed like it had a lot of powerful matchups, but maybe struggled a little bit in certain matchups, too much for it to be a confident bring. But the fact that there's so much mage and that people were bold enough to predict that there would be this much mage, and there is upwards of 30%, they get rewarded for bringing a deck like Priest.
Yeah, for those who may have not have seen the currently popular builds of Priest right now, they tend to be very proactive, very aggressive. These aren't control Priest decks by any means. They tend to be North Shore Cleric into injured, I always want to say injured Valdir. It's not injured Valdir, it's injured Tolvir is this one. With a backup plan, or even a primary plan of Divine Spirit Interfire. So you're basically aggro Priest, and look to get a firm control of the board against aggressive decks and just blow up control decks or slower decks with the Divine Spirit Interfire combo.
And I'd say another key card to watch out for is the extra arms, which was buffed by only 1 mana cheaper, not quite the 2 mana buff to Luna's Pocket Galaxy, but it is that possibility of curving either Cleric or Light Warden into the extra arms, which then gets them out of range of a simple Frostbolt, and makes it really problematic for Mage to deal with.
It's also a very powerful tool alongside Wild Pyromancer, having 2 spells that come off of a single card that are relatively cheap. I mean, 2 is certainly a lot less than 3. You know, and that's one of the big things about the extra arms buff was reducing the cost from 3 to 2. It wasn't just the cost of the upfront version, it's the cost of both halves of it. And that ends up being a huge boon to its combination with Wild Pyromancer, as well as just your ability to use it as just any kind of offensive or even defensive tool to buff up your taunt minions to keep your opponent from being able to attack your face.
On top of that, with Saviors of Old Doom just coming out with Priest cards that all seem to synergize with each other, with the injured Tolvir, like you mentioned, Psycho Pump, and just Holy Ripple even being an AoE heal effect, which doesn't necessarily necessitate the quest to be played. I mean, Priest Quest is, kind of, people are tinkering around with it with maybe a heavier version with Plague of Death I've seen and things like Katrina Muerte, but for this tournament, I do think that with the sheer amount of mages, the lower end heavy Priest is the way you want to go.
Yeah, a lot of these specifically use Psychopomp is like their top end, basically. Like they go up to 4. And when you think about Priest, most of the time when you think about Priest decks, you are generally thinking about these like slower controlling, healing style decks, but that is not remotely what they're doing here. They play out their early game minions, and you kill them, okay, well I Psychopomp them back, they're even harder for you to kill. And we're going to get a look at our players here. This is Mulligan, who is one of the local Korean players, who is going to be up against I believe a fellow Korean as well.
Yeah, Sooni. So I have a story about Mulligan. I did get the chance to meet him over in a collegiate tournament here in South Korea. It was on Jeju Island last November, and the one who actually ended up winning that tournament was Nixley. Mulligan came in second, and his name in English, I believe, is PhysicsKing, and he is a physics major. Makes a lot of sense. He's nowhere near full-time Hearthstone, but he's still consistently putting out good results. Really talented player. And that tournament was funny because it was closed deckless, and you could swap between every round. And I think Nixley's plan was to openly show that he was playing a certain control lineup. PhysicsKing looked over his shoulder and then played heavy anti-control, and then when it came time for the finals, Nixley brought out a full aggro lineup. So a little bit of a bait and switch there.
Well, here is Sooni, Mulligan's opponent for this round. As you mentioned, also a fellow Korean player. And looking at their deck lists look extremely similar. I believe they may even be identical down to the card, at least in the main deck.
Pretty interesting. I mean, it's not a stretch, I'd say, to say that a lot of the people from this scene could have prepped together, or even if they didn't directly prep together, maybe it usually takes 1 or 2 respected players to say this is the deck, and then the rumors spread.
Yeah, even just a little bit of share of information, right? Like you run into someone on ladder, or you hear from someone that someone on ladder was playing this, and it's like, ooh, okay, I'll check that out. I'll give it a try. And Priest has a pretty low representation overall in this tournament, but we have seen a number of high-level players players who have chosen to play it. I believe both Frozen and Just Saiyan, I think, are choosing to play this Priest deck. And we're going to just about ready to get into the game and see that deck in action.
Funny that you mentioned Frozen and Saiyan because I think their results vary drastically. I'm not sure that if it's because of the matchups they ran into in particular, but I know that Frozen is rocking a very unique sideboard with Chef Nomi and Seances for his anti-warrior, I think. So that might be a little bit of innovation there. But as for Priest in general, it actually has, as of right now, a 57% win rate in the tournament, the highest out of any class except Shaman. And I'm not counting Warlock because there's only 2 people playing Warlock. Sure. Too low of a sample size.
All right, well, it is indeed the Priest mirror match that we're going to see here. And Mulligan decides to throw everything back except the Cleric. Cleric, of course, a very powerful tool in the Priest mirror where healing is happening all the time. And another one of those cards from the Savers of Uldum set that has had a big impact on this deck is the Neferset Ritualist. Yeah. That was a card that when I sort of first tried to build Quest Priest, I was like, I don't know about this card. You know, it only seems okay, and I didn't really play it in some of my early builds. And then I put it into my deck at some point, and I was like, oh god, I was wrong. Because a couple of things this card does. One, obviously, you play it next to a injured Tolvir, an injured Blade Master, or just a damaged minion. Heals it up. Great. You know, it's another way to help activate your Cleric, get your card draw. But crucially, it's also just a 2/3 for 2 in a deck that really wants to have minions on the board to cast extra arms or just attack into your opponent's stuff and heal them with a Cleric on board.
I can definitely see it as just, you know, having that big upside, but you can still play it on curve if there's nothing better to do and you're not completely upset about it.
Hello, my friend.
And greetings between them. I do think these players are friends. Sooni, we didn't get to talk about him that much, but giving a quick look at his profile, he has qualified to all 3 of the playoffs for Asia Pacific last year, so definitely no slouch of a player. And I think I did get to cast him as early as 2017 at Korea Major, and he's one of those players that's active in their local team tournament scene. There's a lot of tournaments that I wish would be broadcast out of Korea to the rest of the world because they have some pretty fun antics going on.
We actually did just get confirmation that these 2 players, you know, they did prepare together. They have identical lineups. It's not just a coincidence their decks look so similar. And, you know, we may see them, you know, having a little fun. We see PhysicsKing
with the win.
With a little bit of a, ooh, that is not what I wanted to see. This matchup, Priest matchups in general are very volatile surrounding the early game when they are these proactive style Priest decks. But these decks in particular, you know, they have a single copy of Forbidden Words, 2 copies of Silence, and the rest of their way to deal with minions at all is their own minions. Right. So falling behind a Northshire Cleric at this stage is really dangerous.
I mean, I hate calling games this early, but with this style of deck, as you mentioned, it's so hard to come back from the behind on the board because you don't run things like Shadow Word Pain or Mass Hysteria. It's all about just snowballing the early game.
Yeah, and see, this expression, I think, from Mulligan on the top of the screen there really says it all. It's like, oh, God, okay. Well, I'm behind on the board. If I play anything to try and at least, you know, stall this damage, I'm just going to be feeding Sooni cards here. Even just, say, coining out the High Priest Ahmet would just give, you know, away Cleric cards, give away Acolyte cards. There's an Inner Fire. And, yeah, we see the Neferset Ritualist coming in big, drawing 2 cards, healing up the Cleric and the injured Tolvir here.
Sooni going for the throat here, and honestly, this is absolutely the right line of play, given that PhysicsKing's only answers to single minions are the one of Forbidden Words, and I think that's it. All of these minions have too high of a health total for some type of pyro shenanigans to deal with it.
Right.
So...
And one of them's an Acolyte, so even if you did some pyro shenanigans, you're just feeding your opponent a bunch of cards to follow up. I mean, there could be like pyro into 3 spells, which kills off 2 of the minions, but again, Acolyte gives your opponent 3 cards. The Cleric survives, gives your opponent more resources. I mean, right now, you know, Sooni, he has more arms, Divine Spear, Inner Fire. So he can actually just send that...
16-16?
Right. And has enough damage to punch through the rest. So could send in if he wanted to. Well, there's Powered Shield 2. There's not that much incentive to just go in with that just yet necessarily because there are those 2 copies of Silence. But then again, there's also just not that much that can go wrong.
Yeah. I mean, even if it gets silenced, it's still on board. And it's still going to deal damage at some point.
There it is. Divine Spirit, Inner Fire, Forbidden Words. Just going to send 15, 16, 17, 18 to the face.
Oh my gosh. I think it's safe to start thinking about whether Mulligan will switch to one of those sideboards. In the secondary deck, there is a copy of Mass Hysteria, which I think is
quick.
Yeah, I think it's more meant for aggro, but maybe you're supposed to have that there just to have some way to come back.
Yeah, I mean, if we take a look, you know, just of course there is Sooni on the screen, big smiles there. You know, that's how you want those games to go, and you know that you didn't even need the Divine Spirit Inner Fire there, right? He was just so far ahead on the board that, you know, Mulligan was going to need a miracle basically to get back into it, and you know, would have to have Forbidden Words and Silence to clear off some of these small minions, and then actually get back on the board himself.
These matchups seem like non-games at certain points, but I think another important thing to note is the Mulligan being very important there. I feel like Extra Arms is the game maker.
Well, going first and having a Cleric and Extra Arms is extremely difficult to beat.
Right.
Right? Because even if your opponent has, you know, their like decent turn, you know, it used to be like turn 2. It's like, okay, I coin out Injured Blade Master and I like Circle of Healing it. And now it's like, okay, my Cleric draws me a card off of that, and then I just play the other half of Extra Arms, and now, you know, you're just in a really difficult position unless you have a silence yourself.
And because Extra Arms presents a threat on the other side, I feel like if you're going first with Cleric and say your opponent responds with Cleric, if you have an Inner Fire and don't have the Extra Arms, it might even just be correct to make your Cleric a 3/3 so you can take the value trade. So I think it speaks volumes to how the matchup works. Yeah,
it is. You know, it's very volatile in terms of, you know, who has the initiative just to kick things off, because, like we said, neither of these decks really has much in the way of tools to come back from falling behind. The best thing they can do is Forbidden Words, which isn't really much of a tempo play, right? Like, you can Forbidden Words your opponent's Cleric before they buff it, but once anything gets buffed, Forbidden Words is kind of inefficient to take care of anything on the board.
Yep. So, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to see the tertiary deck. It doesn't make sense in the mirror, but I love that it includes Octosari.
We have seen quite a few Octosaris, yeah. But yeah, I mean, just like we were talking about, right? What matters most is being proactive. The player who gets ahead tends to stay ahead, just kind of based on the way these decks are built. So I wouldn't expect either of these decks, either of these players, to lean on either their secondary or tertiary decks, which look to be built to beat aggressive decks and, say, Warrior specifically.
Smiles upon the just.
So PhysicsKing is going second again, and dare I say it, this might be a matchup where you don't actually want the coin. Going first and having a Cleric on board seems like
it's huge.
Yeah. In this case, though, Sooni does not quite yet have a way to buff the Cleric.
Yeah, I mean, this is you know, a much more sort of straightforward, fair draw from Sooni here. Without any kind of buffs for the Cleric, he's going to rely on, I think, we'll just see Cleric plus Forbidden Words. Forbidden Words is a very good keep here because it's so good at mitigating the possibility of your opponent having a Cleric, because Cleric is so powerful in this matchup.
Yeah. You saw PhysicsKing with a bit of an eye roll seeing the double keep. And the Cleric on one.
Yep, again.
An emotive player. I always appreciate that.
Oh, yeah. And PhysicsKing does not have... Ooh, he's actually going to just coin out his Injured Tolvir. Interesting. Okay.
So the thinking here is that if Extra Arms comes out this turn, then the turn after, the Cleric would then get a value trade on both the minions and be able to be healed. Whereas if you coin 2 into 2, I don't think he has necessarily the time.
Well, if he did have an Extra Arms, for the Cleric at least, it would just humph it. Anyway, because it comes down to 2/3.
True. Man, I don't see a way out. It's actually just...
Well, I mean, this is definitely, you know, this is not a Cleric that's like buffed at eating your guys, right? Right now, Cleric is representing you're spending some mana to draw some cards, which is powerful. There's Inner Fire. And like you're saying, you know, is this a situation where you just Inner Fire to you know, prevent your opponent from being able to use their buffs here? Because Inner Fire on this Cleric to eat the 2/3 prevents your opponent from being able to use Extra Arms in order to get a minion that's bigger than your Cleric to take it down.
I kind of like it. I'm just wondering if you maybe play a Pyro on top of that afterward.
instead of healing your cleric. I think that's also reasonable. Yeah, I really like this from Sooni. I really like this recognition that so much of this matchup is about extra arms. So much is about whoever gets on the board is able to stick a minion and buff it, stays ahead because there's so few ways to deal with just a large minion. And all right, cleric into extra arms.
Yes, this is the quote-unquote comeback for PhysicsKing. And the use of Inner Fire is actually a bit more lax in this deck because they run 2 copies and a copy of Topsy Turvy. Right. So that's essentially a 3rd Inner Fire in many situations.
And it's also not really a matchup where the Inner Fire sort of burst is your primary way to win.
Exactly.
You're more than anything, you're just looking to look at PhysicsKing like, please do not have extra arms. This is the no extra arms prayer we're seeing right now, and it's not there. And now, Sooni, he plays out the injured Blade Master. This may look a little bit weird because it can just get eaten on the board by the cleric, but Sooni knows that more arms is there. The second half of extra arms is there, so he's saying, okay, well, I need to try to get a minion on the board that can at least be some sort of threat if you do like buff and kill my cleric here.
Additionally, if the Blade Master gets dealt with, that's something really powerful in the pool for Psycho Pump.
Exactly.
So now PhysicsKing is presented with a bit more of a dilemma. I do think the more arms is going to get used, but trading on which minion?
I feel like the cleric is the bigger threat here because it represents the threat of additional card generation. You can just more arms attack, and even just if you wanted to, even just circle, get cards off your opponent's minion, as well as getting your cleric out of range of dying to attack.
Also, that makes the injured Tolvir out of range of dying, which means
the Blade Master, right? So
yeah,
you wouldn't be able to end up losing to a Psycho Pump, or rather giving your opponent a fuel off a Psycho Pump. But PhysicsKing decides not to use the circle.
That might have been a little too fancy, but yeah, now that opens up for Sooni to trade this and get a 50% chance to get Blade Master off of Psycho Pump, which I think could be game ending.
It's the cleric,
right.
So that is at least less immediate board presence. Does still represent more long-term value, and that's something that both players definitely also need to be keeping in mind.
So I see that both players have the Witchwood Piper in hand, which indicates that they stayed on their primary decks. So falling behind does not merit the inclusion of Mass Hysteria, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Right, now we got ourselves a 2/6 injured Tolvir, fully healed with Reborn, thanks to Psycho Pump.
So sick, all these interactions. Oh, and I love the preemptive use of Inner Fire to prevent value trades and to make it very awkward for Sooni to get value off the cleric.
But there's extra arms. Yeah, and we can see Pyro. It's going to be... Looked like he was about to double. I'm actually... So this is interesting.
Right.
Could have... Okay, that's what he's doing. Okay. He's going to circle, And now he can attack, trade in the Psycho Pump, gets all these cards, gets another attack with the Cleric off of the 2/1 that comes back, which also gives him a card.
Yeah.
And
At first glance, it looked a little strange to me too, because he could have double buffed and took a 7/7 trade into 6/6, but this is far better because of how much he gets to draw.
Right.
So simply healing up the cleric and trading, I think, makes a lot of sense. But going for a bit more tempo, with all these resources.
Well, a big part of this, you get additional card rather than just healing your cleric here. B, you get another body on the board. And this matchup is so much about the player that is able to establish the board presence that the opponent can't answer, right? And, if we just look at the state of the game here, Sooni has drawn so many more cards thanks to that cleric. Look at the deck sizes. 12 to 19. There's 7 more cards that Sooni has gone through. And that's with PhysicsKing being on the coin and getting an extra card.
Yeah. It does seem like a lot of the matchup is offset by, 1, the initial board states and who gets the initiative, and 2, who gets to draw the most with the clerics. And I guess the relevance of just the 1 additional card in the coin does not offset those possibilities.
Yeah, and this is very, like we said before, this is very much a matchup that can snowball tremendously, whether it's on board or whether it's in the form of resources. Because if one player has a hand like we see PhysicsKing with, okay, I got a Circle of Healing, I got a Topsy-Turvy, I got a Divine Spirit, but I don't really have anything to do with them because I'm behind, versus Sooni, who just has a bunch of stuff and a bunch of cards, bunch of minions on the board. This is just not a situation this deck is really capable of effectively coming back from.
Yeah. Safe to say, both these players
Just
brought
look at the
these
expression
decks.
from PhysicsKing. He's like, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. I guess I'm dead.
Safe to say they both brought Priest without the expectation of running into each other or other Priests, and that's perfectly valid in this type of huge field where Mage is, you know, highly anticipated to be the most popular deck. So I would just say it's a bit unfortunate for PhysicsKing to run into this matchup. It could very well have been Sooni being unfortunate to run into this matchup, but they have tons of rounds to make up for that deficit.
Yeah, looking at the stats, there are 23 total priests in this field. And that is compared to 120 mages.
Right.
So I think a total of about 250 or so players.
I think 330 is what
Oh,
I
is it
saw.
really? Oh, yeah, the math definitely doesn't add up when I'm just looking at this and glancing. But over 250, over 300. So less than 10%, like 8% of the field or something is playing priest.
It is definitely an off-the-wall choice, but one that has been overperforming in terms of people's expectations. And pretty glad to see it, knowing that Mage has a definite weakness.
Well, PhysicsKing gonna have an opportunity to get a bunch of resources here with the Cleric, Pyro, and Circle.
Drawing an Octosari's worth of cards.
And worth noting, this is actually overdrawing Sooni pretty dramatically.
Yeah, did we call
because
it too soon?
it is. I mean, the problem is that there's the rope burning, and what is this doing to significantly address the board? There was the Topsy-Turvy on the Tolvir, so we see just the PhysicsKing is cracking up.
Wait,
is this actually just lethal damage?
It is.
Did he just set up?
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
The
wow.
one.
Okay. This
Ah.
is 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8. So that's what? 15,
21,
21.
36, right?
Yeah, I think this is just lethal.
What? Oh my god, this is awesome. This
Wow.
is
So
legit.
we were
the
just
coolest
talking
thing
about how
I've
this
seen
was.
all day.
Yeah, obviously we called this a little too soon, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that the PhysicsKing that Mulligan was able to set this up, I think more than anything was kind of Sooni perhaps being a little overzealous and not considering the implications of the number of cards that he was drawing. Because having that many minions on the board with a Cleric in a Priest mirror can lead to exactly that.
Wow. I mean, you took all the words out of my mouth. That possibility at all completely flew over my head, but it is something we've seen in Hearthstone many times.
Oh yeah. Going full North Shore. It doesn't have to be full North Shore when it's the Priest Mirror, and they can activate your North Shore for enormous numbers of cards. Frankly, I wonder if there was just literally one fewer minion in play. I don't think that can happen, right? Because that was multiple circles, and I believe it was a bit over lethal, but not like a ton over lethal.
Yeah.
At least in terms of increments of draw, right?
We could count it as 45 because there was still that one other draw from the natural turn. But yeah, because one minion represented 2 more draws because it was 2 circles, that was, I think, the exact amount.
Right. So, we were getting a little into talking about the theory of why you play the deck and this and this and this. And
wow.
I think also, Sooni got a little ahead of himself and just thought, okay, well, I have this dominating board position. I have such an advantage. This is a matchup where it's so hard to come back from falling behind. But PhysicsKing, he just looked at the situation, like, all right, well, this is my only way to get out of this is to chain these card draw effects, not just for me, but for you.
And props to PhysicsKing. Honestly, I feel like that's really the mark of a good Hearthstone player, to take the position that looks completely insurmountable and find the very, very fringe out. Maybe it wasn't even that fringe, and maybe it was a reward for practicing the deck more and more. And we keep mentioning that when a tournament is so fresh into a meta, it really rewards players that spend all the limited time they have really knowing the ins and outs of whatever they bring.
I mean, I'm sure Twitch chat saw that, because they literally always want everyone to always overdraw their opponent. Your opponent can have 2 cards in hand. You're like, overdraw him, get him. You can do it. Kill that Octosari.
Well, chat lethal was real this time.
It was.
So that means we are going to a game 3, and I think both players will now be hyper aware of the possibility of losing a game from out of nowhere.
Yeah, you know, and I mean, we were talking about how snowbally the matchup could have been. And, you know, I mean, frankly, I think Sooni probably had an opportunity to just sacrifice his cleric somewhere in there, right? And I think that he just sort of got distracted by the level of advantage he felt like he had. He kind of just felt like the game was over, and you know, didn't really consider the possibility that you just get chain circled to death off of your cleric.
And I'm still reeling from how cool that was. And now PhysicsKing is on the play. However, he has not hit a cleric, nor anything good to do early on. One thing that's worth noting is that both these lists, and I think Frozen's also has cut Light Warden, which most of the initial priest lists of this type were running.
Yeah, so Light Warden's pretty interesting because Light Warden's also, if you are playing the Priest Mirror, Light Warden is great.
Yeah.
Like, if I believe one of Frozen's, I believe his like tertiary deck actually has, he doesn't have Light Warden main, but he has Light Warden in his tertiary deck because of the sort of awareness of the Priest Mirror. And this is game number 3 that Sooni has cleric on turn 1. We see just PhysicsKing. I really like watching PhysicsKing because his reactions are fantastic.
I am a big fan. I think you could create a whole movie out of just his expressions between those.
Oh God, just
last few games.
look at his hand. He's got those circles. They served him so well last game, and they're like, come on, put me in, coach. I was how you won the last game. You know you want me in your opening hand, right?
Well, there is a cleric on board, so there's always a way. He just needs to be survive for a bit.
Needs a little time.
It probably involves using Forbidden Words on one of these. I'm not quite sure which.
It's interesting because killing the cleric obviously shuts down future card draw, but keeps them out of your circle range, be able to kill them later. But with no hand right now, I sort of have to wonder which of these is more threatening. Rather, no minions in hand for PhysicsKing. He's just going to go ahead and heal himself and say go.
Speaking of saying go, Sooni can just clock him for 9 this turn. Like, extra arms, inner fire. Or you can even clock for 9 the other way, so extra arms on the cleric and then inner fire the 2/6.
I feel like you don't really want to go that in with your buff spells here. Yeah, it looks like we're going to see inner fire plus circle, which is going to get a bit more card draw here from Sooni. This is both of his circles of healing, which is a important note that he doesn't have access to that to overdraw PhysicsKing.
Not just yet.
But this does get a significant amount of damage in, but doesn't commit so much as say extra arms plus inner fire does, because it's worth keeping in mind both these decks do contain 2 copies of silence.
Now, how does PhysicsKing get out of this one? Without a wild pyro of his own, there's not much of a chance for overdraw. And Forbidden Words can only remove the pyro or the cleric, not dealing with the 6 damage problem, which is going to be hitting his face every turn.
Yeah, this is a tough spot. And I feel like to some degree he's thinking, okay, well, both these circles are gone, so the cleric is less of a threat. But there's still 2 copies of Neverset Ritualist in the deck, not to mention just the ability to hero power and heal. So the cleric does remain at least somewhat threatening. And there's Neverset Ritualist.
I can guarantee you Sooni's thinking, is there any way I get overdrawn if I play this next turn? So he would draw 2 now.
I've got 18 cards left.
Go to 16. There'd be 4 minions on board. Say a pyro comes down, a spell, and then 2 circles. That would be another 10 draws.
He's going to Blade Coin, get rid of that Blade Master, and then Neverset.
Okay. Sacrificing the pyro for the greater good, which is not dying out of nowhere.
Yeah, there's only the 1 damage minion now. All right, the 2 circles are ready. No pyro in hand, though.
Yeah, that looks like it's just it.
Well, the powered shield does give him a window to pick something up, but yeah, there's...
Forbidden Words onto the...
Look at, he just perked up a little bit. Can I do it again? Can I do it again?
The most is
no,
10 cards.
There's not nearly, he can overdraw him, and I'm sure chat's going to spam to do just that, but it's not nearly enough to actually end the game.
So the next question is, can he stay alive to maybe set it up for next turn? Problem is, staying alive involves removing something, which goes against his overarching game plan of overdrawing.
I feel like Sooni is just too aware after that last game of that possibility. I wouldn't even be surprised if he like literally just, didn't play anything, like any more minions here, and just pushed damage. That's actually just lethal anyway. I wasn't even looking. And yeah, Sooni with just far superior draws, I would say. In all 3 games, PhysicsKing was able to steal that game too with that hilarious double circle play to fatigue City, but not in game 3.
That was a treat to watch. Despite it being so one-sided in Game 1 and Game 3, that Game 2, I think, made it all worth it from a spectator point of view.
Totally worth. Because, I mean, we really were just like, all right, poor guy, nothing went his way, and then, oh, look, take 40.
I'll hold that out. To me, PhysicsKing is the winner of this set. And he's still 4-1, which is an awesome game score. Sooni moving up to 5-0. I could realistically see these two meeting again later on.
I mean, both these players with at least 4 wins are guaranteed to advance to tomorrow. 4-3 record will make it to tomorrow. So we will be seeing both these players competing in the next stage of the event. Which is great because with the relatively low representation of Priest, it's great to see it doing well.
Yeah. Aside from Priest, I think there's also been a spotlight on Shaman. We didn't get to see too many games of it. I think we did get a little bit of Marikoshe's Shaman, although it didn't actually take the win on that one. So I'd like to see a bit more of these decks that are bubbling under the surface, maybe try and overtake Mage throughout the day.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, most of the Mage success we've seen is in the Mage Mirror match, right? Like, we've actually seen, like, the very first match of the day that we watched was Mage getting obliterated by Rogue. And now it's interesting. It's a huge amount of the field, but has not really been performing as well as a lot of people may have expected.
On top of that, you could also say Warrior has been underperforming because people did say, well, Mage is the deck and Warrior is like the other deck, and then there might be a little bit of Rogue. But those 3 most popular archetypes are not actually doing all that great. So let's see if the story of Priest versus the world and Mage versus the world can continue. We'll go to a break and come back with round 5 filler up next.